How dangerous is Stockholm? That's actually a question that's pretty difficult to answer. Decades ago, I would have said that Stockholm, and Sweden in general, is extremely safe. But these days, well, things are changing. In the last years, Sweden has seen gang wars, rising tension between immigrants and Swedes, and an elevated risk of terrorism. People have been gunned down or had their apartments blown up with explosives. But on the other hand, the vast majority don't notice anything at all about that, myself included. Today I'm gonna visit one of the so-called no-go zones in Stockholm and talk about how dangerous Stockholm really is. In 1968, a new suburb of Stockholm was built, called Rinkeby. It's a typical example of the Million Program. Sweden had a housing shortage in the 1960s, and the government decided that 1 million new homes would be built. The idea was to offer high-quality, affordable housing for everyone, but that's not exactly how things turned out. The Million Program houses weren't very nice looking, but they did provide quality housing at affordable prices. Most people wanted to live someplace nicer, though. That meant that many of the Million Program areas became filled with lower-income families and with immigrants. And that's what happened with Rinkeby. By the 90s, it was infamous as a place where mostly immigrants lived. These days, 17,000 people live in Rinkeby, and 62.2% of them are born outside of Sweden. And 92.1% have a foreign origin, such as having immigrant parents. Rinkeby, together with nearby Tensta and Husby, is an example of what people call a Stockholm no-go zone. When foreign people talk about Stockholm no-go zones, they imagine a lawless area where gangs roam the streets and gun down anyone who goes there. Reality is a bit different. Rinkeby, together with other places like Tensta, Husby, Vårby and Norsborg, is a low-income area with high unemployment. That of course leads to a higher crime rate, more drug use and an increased police presence. But there's no place in Sweden that's a literal no-go zone. People visit these areas and the police frequent them. The term no-go zone is just propaganda. But that doesn't mean that you don't have to be careful. Overall, Stockholm is a safe city and Sweden is a safe country. But there's crime either way. You can still get pickpocketed in Stockholm, or scammed, or even mugged. And you might find yourself assaulted if you're walking all alone late at night in a dark alley. None of this is common, but it can happen, just like it can happen in any city. But what about the explosions and the gun violence that the news has been talking about? Is Stockholm turning into a war zone where people duck for cover in between the lovely architecture and the lush greenery? Well, not exactly. There seems to be two schools of thought about all of this. One is that there's a greater frequency of gun-related violence and bombings that could affect anyone, so everyone needs to be afraid, because it could happen to you. The other is that all of these crimes are related to gang rivalries, and it doesn't really affect normal people. It's just gangs eliminating each other. The truth is, as always, somewhere in between. I'm not a big fan of painting things in either black or white. There's always too many nuances to take into consideration. Sweden does have a gang problem. We've been way too relaxed about gang-related crime, so now it's all caught up with us, and we're sitting here with our pants down by our ankles. Normal people have been killed by these gang wars, and at least one apartment has been blown up because they thought that it belonged to a rival gang member. But it was just some poor random person who lived there. And if we don't do anything about it, it will just get worse. More people will get hurt, and the gangs will get a stronger foothold. But on the other hand, does this mean that you have to be worried when you're visiting Stockholm? Of course not. I spend most of my days in the city, and I'm often out on town getting drunk in shady bars. And nothing has ever happened to me, except when I got pickpocketed in Bishop Arms. Those bastards. And the same goes for all the millions of tourists that visit Stockholm every year. The gang violence doesn't really affect them, or me. But what if you're not a man like me? What if you're a woman? Well, time to get into some touchy subjects. Okay, let's get into the favorite topic of internet trolls all over the world, Sweden's high rate of sexual crimes. First of all, yes, there is a high statistic of reported sexual assaults in Sweden. One reason is that people report these crimes in Sweden more often than in many other countries, and that's sort of a good thing that they're actually being reported. Another reason is that Sweden counts a lot more as sexual assault compared to many other countries. We have a low tolerance for any undesired physical contact. And finally, every single incident is reported as a separate crime. That means that if a spouse sexually abuses their partner every day for a month, then it's reported as 30 different crimes. Well, or 28 or 31, you get a point. Many other countries would count this as a single crime, if they even count it at all, since it's between married people. So, no, things aren't quite as bad as some people believe. Does this mean that things are good? Absolutely not. Sweden still has horrible statistics compared to the rest of Scandinavia. There's been an increase in violent sexual assaults, and many women report that they now feel unsafe in Sweden compared to, for example, 10 years ago. I'm not a woman, believe it or not, and I can't really comment on how it feels to be a woman in Sweden. So I won't say anything for sure about it all. I'll just say that I believe that a woman would rather walk the streets of Stockholm at night than walk in dark alleys in many other cities. Now, that was one touchy subject, so let's get even further into the metaphorical excrement creek. Let's talk about immigration. If people aren't talking about Sweden's sexual assault statistics, they're talking about immigrants. Some say that the rise in crime is all to be blamed on the influx of immigrants we've had lately. And others say that that's absolutely untrue, and that it's skewed statistics that leads to that conclusion. Guess what I'm gonna say next? That the truth lies somewhere in between, because things are more complex than that. Sweden has a problem with immigrants. Some say that we've accepted too many, or at least that we've accepted too many from certain groups. Others say that Sweden is to blame for not doing enough to integrate newcomers into society. Either way, it's unfortunately pretty much a fact that immigrants have a high rate of unemployment or lower paying jobs, and that means that they end up in so-called no-go zones in Stockholm. So is it really any surprise that they're highly represented in crime statistics? Or that they are the ones that are targeted for recruitment by gangs? So what's the solution to all of this? I believe that every society is constantly changing. Sweden today isn't what it was 20 years ago. And it's definitely not the Sweden that I knew when I grew up. But that was true in the 1950s as well. And in the 1800s. Change is inevitable. That said, I can understand if people are worried about the fact that 20% of Sweden's population wasn't born in Sweden. That puts a huge stress on how to get everyone integrated into society. But integration is the key to everything in my view. Sweden is a pretty great country after all, so all we need to do is make everyone understand just how great it is to make everyone Swedishified. And at the same time, maybe we can adopt some new things to make it even greater. And if you're joking on that figure of 20% not being born in Sweden, well, Sweden is accepting fewer and fewer immigrants these days, so steps are being taken in that direction too. But I still think that the key point is that we need to make newcomers integrated rather than focus on segregation. It might take time, and we might not end up with the Sweden that we're used to, but in the long run, I think that this is the only viable solution. And that brings me back to this so-called no-go zone in Stockholm, Rinkeby. Today is Rinkebyfestivalen, a festival celebrating the community here, and it's intended to build bridges. Bridges across cultures, bridges across differences and bridges across problems. Which is pretty ironic because there's a lot of debate over a bridge that connects Rinkeby with nearby Ursvik. People in Ursvik don't want people in Rinkeby to have easy access to their part of town because they believe that it will introduce unwanted people and lower the real estate worth. So while I can talk all day about my hopes for integration and that Stockholm doesn't really have any no-go zones, there's still quite a noticeable divide. As a final thought, there's one thing that I haven't really talked about, and that's terrorism. I feel safe in Stockholm and Sweden, but the threat of terrorism is looming over us now. However, that doesn't really have anything to do with how safe Stockholm is as a city, in my view, or Sweden as a country. That's in the hands of lunatics and fanatics. No one can say what's gonna happen, and you can't really plan ahead for things like that. So I'm just gonna continue to feel safe and happy in Stockholm, and I hope that you will as well. And that was my pretty long-winded way of answering the question of how dangerous Stockholm really is. I hope you found it interesting. Like and subscribe, but most importantly, have a great day.